Number 5.
Since this list is already filled with demons, aliens, ghosts, and headless horsemen, I thought I would put vampires in this list too, with a film called Let Me In. And it is about a 12-year-old kid named Owen, played by Cody Smith-McPhee, who gets bullied by kids a lot in his school and would often think about doing terrible things to them. And then she meets a strange girl named Abby, played by Chloe Grace Moretz, who only goes out at night, and once people start disappearing, Owen soon realizes that she's a vampire. It is an American remake of the Swedish film Let the Right One In, and it is directed by Matt Reeves, who also did Cloverfield, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, War for the Planet of the Apes, and The Batman. This is a very dark and tragic story about two kids becoming friends, although this movie does hint that they might become more than that. And you do feel some sympathy for both of them. Like with Owen, you do get to care about him quite a bit because he lives with his mother, who is religious, and his dad is not religious, and they're both going through a divorce, and that puts Owen in an emotional state. And Owen is constantly being beaten up by these bullies, with one of them going too far by scarring him in the face, and you do feel really bad for him when that happens, and you also get to understand more of why he's becoming close with Abby. And with Abby being Owen's new next door neighbor, she lives with her guardian, who constantly goes out at night, killing people, taking their blood, and feeding it to her so that she doesn't do any of the dirty work herself. And she doesn't really have any friends until she meets Owen, and they become pretty close with each other. And I thought both Cody Smith-McPhee and Chloe Grace Moretz were really good together in the film. I thought they had pretty good chemistry. The atmosphere is also a highlight. Like, it's very well lit in the nighttime scenes whenever you see Owen out in the playground and it's covered in snow, and you get these street lights that have a bit of an orangish red type of glow. If you enjoy vampire movies and you loved Matt Reeves' previous work, I do recommend watching this film, and the best way to describe it is that it's more of a dark and gothic take on the Romeo and Juliet story.
Number 4.
Coming in at number 4 is a psychological horror film, and it's one of my favorites, and that film is Frailty, directed by Bill Paxton and starring both him and Matthew McConaughey. It takes place in the 70s and is about a religious father, played by Bill Paxton, who one night gets a vision from an angel telling him to kill demons or else the apocalypse will begin, which gets his older son a little suspicious and thinking that he might be delusional. I remember watching this film on TV at one point, and it really surprised me because I do like Bill Paxton as an actor. I liked him in movies like Aliens and A Simple Plan, which is very overlooked, by the way. Please watch that movie if you haven't yet. But here, I think this might be his best performance. Bill Paxton is phenomenal in this movie. His character really believes that he kills demons to save the world, and his younger son Adam believes it, but not his older son Fenton, because he's the only one in the family that doesn't believe in God, and he's not religious, and he's the only one in the family that thinks that his father might be crazy. And that puts both Bill Paxton and Fenton in a serious conflict with each other, because they start out as a nice and normal family until Paxton gets this vision from an angel, and that leads to some very disturbing moments where Fenton unfortunately has to watch his father kill people. We also cut back to modern day with Matthew McConaughey as one of the sons, explaining to this detective about where Paxton was hiding these bodies. And when he's explaining this to the detective, you see the remorse in his eyes, and you understand more about the trauma that he went through as a kid, and Matthew McConaughey was really good as the character. If you have not seen Frailty yet, I strongly recommend it. It is a really good Bill Paxton film. It's one of my favorites. In fact, it might actually be my favorite of his.
Number 3.
Here's a curious question. Anyone here love The Shining? I think most of us can agree that it is an excellent horror film, And this next film I'm gonna mention is also an excellent horror movie, and in my opinion, it's very underrated, and that film is Dr. Sleep. It takes place 30 years after the events of The Shining, where Danny Torrance, played by Ewan McGregor, is traumatized by all the events that he witnessed when he was little, and then he finds out about a teenage girl who also has the ability to shine like he does and has to protect her from Rose the Hat, played by Rebecca Ferguson, and this cult that want to kill her. This is directed by Mike Flanagan, who is a big name on Netflix right now with shows like The Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass, and with films like Ouija Origin of Evil and Oculus. And I thought this was an excellent movie that does get you to care about Danny quite a bit, because he's trying to have a normal life even though he had a very traumatizing moment in his childhood. But when he has to try to protect this girl from this cult, it becomes hard for him to ignore it, and you do feel sympathy for him because of that. And Rebecca Ferguson is phenomenal as Rose the Hat. She is very terrifying when she needs to be, and her character usually looks for people who have shining abilities and uses them to help her cult, but for the wrong reasons. I think she is very underrated in this film, and I've always liked her as an actress. I liked her in the Mission Impossible films, but for me, I think this might be her best performance. And it's also one of those films where it gets the nostalgic stuff right, like it gets you invested in the characters and the story first, and once you're fully invested in everything that's going on, then it saves all the nostalgic stuff for the third act. And it feels earned. It felt like the audience was finally satisfied after learning more about the characters and getting to see more of the stuff that they remembered from The Shining. And sadly, this movie didn't do so well at the box office, probably because people were kind of expecting this to be like The Shining and it wasn't as good. And no, it's not as good as The Shining, but I'm not gonna say it as a bad thing because it was never gonna be, and that's really unfair. Then again, The Shining didn't do so well either. Yes, that movie's a classic, but when that movie first came out, critics, audiences, and Stephen King himself, the author of the Shining book, hated this movie. But over the years, it became a classic and people's favorite horror movie of all time, and I think Dr. Sleep might have the same thing in the future.
Number 2.
Now this movie kind of fits in more with the overlooked horror films, but for me, I think it's both overlooked and underrated, and that film is Butterfly Kisses. It is both a found footage and mockumentary about a failing director that finds a bunch of videotapes about a student film about an urban legend known as Peeping Tom. He then tries to convince other people about this story being true, while it also affects his mental state and his life after he becomes obsessed with it. Now this film is very familiar to most filmmakers, at least ones that I've worked for in film school, but for most audience members, not a lot of people know about this film, and that's why I think it's both an overlooked and underrated horror movie. When you see the director learn more about this stuff, you see how it really affects his life and makes him do some things that make him pretty unlikable and make his filmmaking crew very concerned about him. And once you see those tapes play, you get a very disturbing feeling once you see these teenagers learn about this entity that lives inside this cave. Because this entity is one of those things where you have to look directly at it, because if you blink once or you look away, it will come closer to you and kill you. So it's basically like the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who, except the way this movie does it is a little more disturbing. I remember watching this film on Amazon Prime a few years ago, and it really disturbed me. Like, it really unsettled me. And I do really recommend watching Butterfly Kisses if you haven't yet, and it is on Amazon Prime still, last I checked, even though it's more on freebie now. But if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it on there. And I'm not gonna say anything else about Butterfly Kisses. I just want you to watch the film if you're a horror fan.
Number 1.
Alright. The number one spot on this list. The most underrated and overlooked horror film on this list. Now, not a lot of people saw this film when it first came out for a good reason, but thanks to the internet, it has developed a following, but a lot of people outside of the internet still don't really know what this movie is. And this movie is definitely worth watching if you're a fan of horror movies like this. People on the internet, I give you The Empty Man, directed by David Pryor. This movie is about a former cop, played by James Badge Dale, who has to find this girl that's been missing somewhere, and he also learns about this new cult that came to town and are summoning this evil entity that is supposed to do terrible things to this town. And that's all I'm gonna say, because there's a lot more to tell, but that's all about spoilers, unfortunately. Now, why is this the number one spot in this list? Well, it's because it has more of the dark and disturbing stuff and some of the weird stuff that give you questions about what you saw and what they're supposed to mean. It has a very dark atmosphere that does give you a very unsettling feeling, and once you learn more about this cult and why they want to bring this entity, it becomes more riveting and disturbing. And another thing to praise about this film is the cinematography. This is a very well shot movie with the cop trying to go to places and learning more about where this girl might be hiding and what this cult is supposed to be. And the lighting for the film in the nighttime scenes does give the film a more unsettling feeling. And it has some creepy moments that never fell flat for me. They really made me feel uncomfortable. In particular, there's this one scene around a campfire. I'm not going to say what happens in this scene, but when that scene was happening, it really made me uncomfortable in the right way. Now, similar to Butterfly Kisses, there are some things in this film that I do want to talk more about, but they unfortunately relate to spoilers, so I'm not going to say more. I just want you to experience the film yourself, and it is on Hulu, so if you have Hulu, you can watch it there. Now, one of the big reasons I put this film on the number one spot is because when it was first released in theaters in October, it was only in theaters for a day. I'm being serious, just one day. And why is that? Well, it's because it came out in 2020, and that's when COVID was still a huge problem for a lot of people, and it also came out during like the whole 20th Century Fox and Disney merger thing, and that didn't get a lot of people to see this movie, sadly. Now, you're probably wondering, does this movie have a Blu-ray and DVD release? Well, sadly, no. It doesn't have a physical release in the United States, but it has been on TV a couple of times, and you can rent it on Amazon, and you can find it on Hulu. The Empty Man, the most underrated and overlooked horror film on this list. And that's all I got for the top 10 underrated horror films. There are some I would have mentioned, like Trick or Treat or The Babadook, which were underrated at the time, but sadly, they're not anymore. They're very popular for horror fans. And there were some other horror films I was thinking of putting on the list, like The Guest and Annihilation, but I couldn't because, one, The Guest was more of a thriller instead of a horror, and Annihilation is more of a sci-fi film than a horror. But maybe I'll talk about them next year. We'll see. And I hope you guys enjoyed this ranking of the underrated horror films. It's filled with movies that are different, weird, and creepy. And I hope some of these did get you interested in watching them, and I mean, who knows, maybe some of these could end up being your next favorite horror movies. And if you guys have your favorite underrated horror films of all time that deserve more praise than they should, let me know what those films are in the comments below. And as always, if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a thing, because it makes my channel grow. Hit the notification bell so you know what other videos I am posting. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a happy Halloween.